In the quiet hours before dawn, the shores of the Moonlit Isles are calm, the waves whispering secrets only the ocean knows. Kale, a fisherman with calloused hands and a heart full of restless dreams, walks the beach as he does every morning, searching for nets tangled with the sea's offerings. But today, the tide brings something extraordinary, a pendant, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly glow. As his fingers brush against it, a hum vibrates through his bones, and suddenly, his mind is flooded with visions. A temple buried beneath the waves, its walls etched with forgotten symbols, and a massive sea serpent coiled in the depths, its eyes blazing with ancient fury. Kale doesn't yet know it, but this pendant is no mere trinket. It's a key to the legendary Enchanted Waters, a force of untold power that controls the tides and safeguards the Isles. With this discovery, Kale's simple life is about to unravel, and the peaceful existence of the Moonlit Isles will be forever changed. The question is, what happens when the balance of power shifts, and who else is searching for it? As Kale made his way back to his village, the weight of the pendant in his satchel felt heavier with every step. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the once familiar path seemed shrouded in an eerie quiet. When he arrived, the first sign that something was amiss came from the sea. The tides, usually predictable, now rose and fell in erratic patterns, as if the ocean itself had grown restless. Nets that once brimmed with fish came up empty, leaving the village's fishermen baffled and uneasy. Whispers began to spread among the villagers, stories of a shadowy figure seen lingering near the shoreline, its gaze fixed on Kale. At first, he tried to dismiss the rumors, chalking them up to fear and superstition. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that these strange occurrences were tied to the pendant he carried. Desperate for guidance, Kale turned to his childhood friend, Lyra, a skilled navigator with an uncanny ability to rid the seas. Lyra had always been a voice of reason in his life. When Kale revealed the pendant to her, her reaction was immediate and grave. "This is no ordinary artifact," she warned, her voice low and urgent. "It carries a power that could doom us all. You must destroy it before it's too late." Her words struck a chord, but Kale found himself torn. The pendant's allure was undeniable. It hummed with an energy that seemed to promise salvation. With their village suffering from a relentless drought, Kale couldn't ignore the possibility that the pendant might hold the key to their survival. Despite Lyra's pleas, Kale chose to keep the pendant, convinced that its power could be harnessed for good. The decision drove a wedge between them, their once unbreakable bond now strained by mistrust and fear. As Kale clung to hope, the shadowy presence lurking at the edges of their village grew bolder, hinting at the storm of conflict that lay ahead. That night, as the moon cast its silvery glow over the village, Kale drifted into a restless sleep. Once more, the submerged temple appeared in his dreams, its ancient stones shimmering beneath the water. But this time, a spectral figure emerged, a ghostly presence, who spoke in a voice that echoed like the depths of the ocean. "The serpent stirs," it warned, its words heavy with foreboding. "Its awakening will bring destruction unless you act swiftly." Startled, Kale awoke, his heart racing, only to find the village engulfed in chaos. A massive tidal wave had struck without warning, obliterating the docks and leaving devastation in its wake. The villagers, their faces etched with fear and anger, pointed accusing fingers at Kale, blaming him for provoking the wrath of the sea spirits. Amid the turmoil, Kale tried to explain, but his words fell on deaf ears. Lyra confronted him, her frustration boiling over. "This is what happens when you meddle with forces beyond your understanding," she snapped, her voice trembling with emotion. The argument grew heated, both of them caught in a storm of their own making. But before they could resolve their differences, a group of mercenaries arrived, their eyes fixed on Kale's pendant. "Hand it over," their leader demanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Realizing the danger, Kael and Lyra had no choice but to flee, their shared peril forcing them to set aside their differences. As they escaped into the night, the weight of their situation settled over them. The pendant, once a symbol of hope, now seemed like a curse, drawing danger at every turn. Their journey across the Moonlit Isles had begun, but it was far from a simple quest. Ahead lay untold challenges, treacherous landscapes, ancient secrets, and the ever-looming threat of the awakened serpent. Together, Kael and Lyra would have to navigate not only the dangers of the world around them, but also the fragile trust between them, knowing that their survival depended on more than just luck or skill. The Isles held both peril and promise, and their path would test every ounce of courage they possessed. The boat creaked under the strain of the churning waves as Kael and Lyra fought to keep their course. The mercenaries were closing in, their shouts carried on the salty wind, but the real danger lay beneath the surface. Strange shapes darted in the dark waters, drawn to the pendant's pulsing glow. Lyra's hands moved swiftly, adjusting the sails with precision, born of years navigating these waters. Her knowledge of the Moonlit Isles was their lifeline, yet her silence spoke volumes. Every glance she threw Kale's way was sharp with resentment, a silent accusation that he alone had brought this chaos upon them. Kale gripped the tiller, his knuckles white as he wrestled with his thoughts. The pendant around his neck felt heavier with each passing moment. What had started as a desperate bid to save his village now felt like a reckless gamble. He glanced at Lyra, her face set in a hard line, and the weight of her gaze made him question everything. Was this journey worth the mounting peril? The sea seemed to echo his doubts, its waves rising like restless spirits. Their path led them to the Whispering Caves, a place where the wind carried voices from another age. The entrance loomed like a gaping maw, its walls lined with ancient carvings that seemed to watch them with knowing eyes. Lyra stepped forward, her fingers tracing the symbols etched into the stone. "These markings," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the wind, "they tell a story, one we've been blind to." Kale moved closer, his heart pounding as he studied the cryptic images. They spoke of the pendant not as a weapon, but as a key, a means to awaken something far greater than any of them had anticipated. As the truth began to unravel, the air grew thick with tension. Lyra turned to Kale, her eyes blazing. "Do you see now? This isn't just about your village or mine. You've unleashed something we can't control." Kale swallowed hard, the enormity of his mistake settling over him like a storm cloud. Yet, even as doubt gnawed at him, a flicker of determination remained. They had come too far to turn back, and the whispers of the caves seemed to urge them forward, deeper into the unknown. As Kael and Lyra step deeper into the shadowy caves. The air grows heavy with the weight of ancient secrets. Their lanterns cast flickering light on the walls, revealing intricate carvings etched into the stone. Each stroke tells a story, a cryptic message left by those who came before. Kale traces the grooves with his fingers, his focus sharp, while Lyra studies the symbols with a scholar's precision. Together, they piece together the tale of the Pendant, a key to the Temple of Tides, a place shrouded in myth and guarded by a serpent of unimaginable power. The carvings speak of the Enchanted Waters, a force capable of altering the fate of the Moonlit Isles, but they also carry a dire warning. To awaken the serpent without performing the sacred ritual is to unleash a curse that will doom the land. Kale's jaw tightens as the truth sinks in. The mercenaries they've been fleeing aren't just after treasure. They are after power, the kind that could unravel everything. Lyra's voice is soft but firm as she translates the final symbols. If they reach the temple first, the Isles won't survive. She hesitates, her gaze drifting to Kale. But even if we stop them, awakening the serpent comes with its own risks. Are you sure this is worth it? Kale meets her eyes, his resolve unshaken. We don't have a choice. If we don't act, they'll destroy everything. We have to get to the temple before they do. Lyra exhales slowly, her fingers brushing the pendant at her neck. Then I'll help you, but we'll need to trust each other, and right now, that's not something I'm sure we can do. The tension between them lingers like the damp air of the cave, unspoken but palpable. Kale knows they're running out of time, not just to beat the mercenaries, but to bridge the gap between them. Together, they step back into the moonlight, the pendant's weight a constant reminder of the burden they now carry. The path ahead is treacherous, and their alliance is fragile, but the fate of the Isles depends on what they do next. As the group stepped out of the shadowy caves, the air shifted, sensing danger before it struck. Vera, a merciless captain known for her cunning and brutality, emerged at the head of a band of mercenaries, her sharp eyes locked on Kale's pendant. Without warning, the ambush unfolded, swords clashing and shouts echoing through the rocky terrain. The battle was fierce, each moment a struggle for survival. Kale, driven by desperation, clutched the pendant and felt its power surge through him. In a blinding burst of energy, he unleashed a force that sent the mercenaries reeling and chipped away at the cave walls. But the cost was high. Lyra, caught in the blast, fell to the ground, injured and shaken. The tension between them hardened into something deeper, a silent divide that neither could bridge. As they hurried away, the weight of what had just happened pressed on Kale. The pendant's power was intoxicating, but now he couldn't ignore the fear of what it might turn him into. And though the mercenaries were momentarily defeated, they knew Vera wouldn't give up. Her obsession with the pendant was relentless, and her next move could be even more dangerous. As Kael and Lira arrived at the edge of the coastal village, the air was thick with the scent of salt and the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. The village, nestled between jagged cliffs and the sea, seemed like a place of refuge until the wary eyes of the villagers met theirs. It was clear that outsiders were not welcome here. The whispers began almost immediately, hushed voices, carrying tales of strangers who brought misfortune. Kale instinctively reached for the pendant around his neck, unaware that it would soon become the center of a storm. Moments after they entered the village, a strange phenomenon unfolded. The well in the center of the square, once filled with fresh water, began to overflow, but not with the clear liquid the villagers relied on. Instead, salt water surged from its depths, spilling onto the cobblestones and drawing gasps of horror from the crowd. All eyes turned to Kale, his pendant glowing faintly, as the villagers accused him of cursing their water source. Panic and anger swelled, threatening to erupt into chaos. Lyra, ever quick on her feet, stepped forward with a calm smile and a steady voice. She spoke of misunderstandings and coincidence, weaving her words with charm and wit to soothe the villagers' fears. Her presence was disarming, and slowly, the tension began to ease. But while the crowd dispersed, Kale's unease only deepened. He couldn't shake the guilt that weighed on him, the belief that somehow he had brought this upon them. That night, as the village slept beneath the moonlit sky, Kale sat alone by the water's edge, the pendant cold in his hands. He considered casting it into the sea, freeing himself from its burden. But as he raised his hand, a vision gripped him: his home village, parched and cracking under an unrelenting drought, its people desperate for the life-giving water they once took for granted. The pendant wasn't just a curse, it was a responsibility, a key to something greater. With a heavy heart but renewed resolve, Kale tucked the pendant back beneath his tunic, knowing that his journey was far from over. The Moonlit Isles still called to him, and he could not turn away. As dawn broke over the Moonlit Isles, the air felt heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. Kael and Lira pressed forward, their boots sinking into the damp earth of the forest path. It wasn't long before they stumbled upon a figure, cloaked in ragged garments, sitting beneath the gnarled branches of an ancient tree. His eyes, sharp and piercing, seemed to see straight through them. This was no ordinary traveler. This was the Hermit of the woods, a man whispered about in local legends, but rarely seen. The Hermit's voice was low, almost a rumble, as he spoke of the ritual, the only way to control the serpent that guarded the temple. But his words carried a weight that made Kale's stomach churn. To tame the beast, the Hermit said, a life must be given. One of you must surrender yourselves to the serpent's hunger. The revelation hit Kale like a cold wave. His mind raced, panic clawing at his thoughts. Sacrifice. It couldn't be the only way. Lyra, though, stood firm. Her jaw tightened as she absorbed the Hermit's words, her eyes narrowing with resolve. There's always another path, she said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. We didn't come this far to give up now. Her determination was a stark contrast to Kale's growing unease, and it sparked a flicker of hope, or maybe defiance, in him. Yet, as they left the Hermit behind, his cryptic warning lingered in the air like a shadow. The serpent knows no mercy. He had called after them, and the temple demands its due. The words echoed in their minds as they trudged onward, each step bringing them closer to the temple's looming silhouette. The bond between Kael and Lyra, once unshakable, now felt fragile, tested by the weight of the Hermit's prophecy. Kale couldn't shake the image of one of them falling to the serpent's maw, while Lyra seemed to channel her fear into a steely resolve. Their journey had hardened her, but Kale wondered if it had also distanced her from him. As the temple's shadow stretched over them, the question hung in the air, unspoken but unavoidable. Would their bond withstand the trials ahead, or would the serpent's hunger tear them apart? The path forward was fraught with danger, but one thing was certain: they couldn't turn back now. The storm roared with a fury that seemed almost alive, as if the sea itself had turned against them. Kale gripped the sides of the boat, his hands trembling as the pendant around his neck pulsed with an erratic, menacing light. Each flash sent a surge of power through the air, stirring the waves into monstrous swells that threatened to swallow them whole. Behind them, the unmistakable silhouette of Vera's ship loomed closer, its black sails cutting through the tempest like a predator on the hunt. There was no time to think, only to act. Lyra stood at the helm, her face set in grim determination. Despite the chaos around them, her movements were steady and precise, her hands guiding the boat through the churning waters with a skill born of years at sea. "Hold on," she shouted over the wind, her voice barely audible above the storm's roar. Kale tried to respond, but another wave crashed over the deck, drenching him and nearly tearing the pendant from his grasp. The pendant's power was growing more unstable by the moment, its energy lashing out in bursts that sent shockwaves through the water. Kale could feel it, a searing heat that burned through his chest, mingled with a strange pull that seemed to drain his strength. He clenched his teeth, forcing himself to focus. He had to regain control, had to calm the storm before it tore them apart. But the more he tried, the more the pendant resisted, as if it had a will of its own. Lyra glanced back at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. "We're not going to make it if you can't get that thing under control," she yelled. Kale nodded, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the noise and focus on the pendant's energy. But it was like trying to hold onto wildfire, impossible and painful. The chase continued, each moment more desperate than the last. Vera's ship was gaining, her mercenaries relentless in their pursuit. The storm raged on, the waves crashing around them with a ferocity that seemed almost unnatural. And then, just as it felt like they were about to be overtaken, Lyra spotted a narrow cove hidden among the jagged rocks. With a sharp turn, she steered the boat toward it, the hull scraping against the stone as they slipped into the shelter of the cliffs. The sudden calm was almost surreal. The storm still raged beyond the cove, but here, the water was still. Kale slumped against the side of the boat, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Lyra joined him, her face pale but resolute. "That was too close," she muttered, her voice trembling. Kale looked down at the pendant, its light now dim but still flickering faintly. His hands shook as he touched it, the weight of what he just experienced settling over him like a heavy cloak. This power, it wasn't just a tool, it was dangerous, unpredictable. And every time he used it, it seemed to take a piece of him in return. He glanced at Lyra, her determination, a stark contrast to his own growing uncertainty. They'd escaped this time, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the cost of wielding the pendant's power might be too high. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the waves, Kael and Lyra finally reached the Temple of Tides. This ancient structure seemed to rise from the sea itself, its towering columns partially submerged, as if the ocean claimed it as its own. The air was thick with salt and mystery, and the faint sound of rushing water echoed through the ruins. but the temple's grandeur was matched by its defenses. At its entrance stood a series of ancient traps and riddles, each designed to test not just their skill, but their ability to work together. Kale, ever the pragmatist, reached for the moonlit pendant around his neck, its glow intensifying as they approached the first challenge. He believed its power would guide them through, a shortcut to their goal. But Lyra hesitated, her brow furrowed with concern. She argued that the temple's trials weren't meant to be bypassed. They were meant to be solved. Relying on the pendant could lead us into more danger, she warned, her voice steady but firm. We need to think this through, not rush in blindly. Their differing approaches quickly sparked tension. Kale's frustration grew as Lyra spent precious moments deciphering an engraved riddle on the temple wall. "We don't have time for this," he snapped, his impatience boiling over. Lyra shot back, her tone sharp. "And we don't have time for mistakes. If we trigger one of these traps, we're done for." The argument escalated, their voices echoing through the temple's cavernous halls, until finally they reached an uneasy compromise. With Kale's pendant illuminating their path and Lyra's careful interpretation of the riddles, they slowly navigated the temple's treacherous defenses. Each step required trust, each solution demanded teamwork, and as they finally stood before the inner sanctum's towering doors, a sense of accomplishment washed over them. The trials had tested not just their minds, but their bond, forcing them to confront their differences and find common ground. With a deep breath, they pushed the doors open, stepping into the heart of the Temple of Tides, where the next chapter of their journey awaited. As Kael and Lyra stepped deeper into the ancient temple, the air around them hums with an otherworldly energy. Before them lies the Enchanted Waters, a radiant pool that seems to breathe with a life of its own. Its surface shimmers and pulses, casting an ethereal glow across the chamber. Kale's eyes widen as he feels the sheer power emanating from it. This is what they've been searching for, the key to saving his village from the blight that's slowly consuming it. The temptation is overwhelming. With just a touch of the waters, he could harness their magic, turning the tide of despair into hope. But Lyra's voice cuts through his thoughts, sharp and urgent. She reminds him of the Hermit's warning. The enchanted waters are not a gift, but a test. Their power comes at a cost, one that could unravel the very fabric of the world if misused. Before they can fully consider their next move, chaos erupts. Beira and her mercenaries burst into the temple, their weapons drawn and eyes hungry for the water's power. In their haste, they trigger an ancient trap, the ground shuddering beneath their feet. A low, menacing hiss fills the air as a colossal serpent, its scales glinting like obsidian, rises from the shadows. The temple groans, its walls beginning to crumble as the serpent coils itself, ready to strike. Kael and Lyra exchange a panicked glance. This is no longer about the waters. It's about survival. The floor cracks, chunks of stone tumbling from the ceiling as the serpent lunges. Kale grabs Lyra's hand, pulling her out of harm's way just as the serpent's fangs snap inches from where they stood. They scramble through the collapsing temple, dodging falling debris and the serpent's relentless attacks. Every step is a gamble, every breath a prayer. Beira and her mercenaries are no longer a threat. They're scrambling just as desperately, caught in the chaos they unleashed. The temple's once sacred halls are now a death trap. collapsing under the weight of its own defenses. Kael and Lyra's only hope is to outrun the serpent and escape with their lives before the temple becomes their tomb. As Kael found himself thrust into the chaos, the world around him seemed to dissolve into a blur of motion and sound. The temple quaked violently, its ancient stones groaning under the strain. In the confusion, he was separated from Lyra, his only ally in this treacherous place. Before he could regroup, a cold, menacing presence loomed behind him. Vera. Her voice cut through the cacophony, sharp and commanding, as she demanded the pendant. Kael's grip tightened around the artifact, his resolve hardening. He knew what was at stake. Surrendering it to Vera would mean disaster for the Moonlit Isles. With a firm refusal, he braced himself for what came next. Vera, swift and relentless, lunged at him, her movements a deadly dance of precision and fury. The clash was brutal, each strike echoing through the crumbling temple. Vera's skill was unmatched, her every move calculated to overwhelm him. Kael struggled to keep up, his breath ragged, his body pushed to its limits. But just as it seemed he might fall, a surge of energy erupted from the pendant, its power coursing through him like a flood. For a fleeting moment, he felt invincible, his strength amplified as he turned the tide of the battle. With a final, decisive blow, he sent Vera sprawling to the ground, but victory came at a cost. The pendant's unleashed energy further destabilized the temple, chunks of stone plummeting from above. Kael barely managed to escape the collapsing chamber, his heart pounding as the serpent's roars grew louder, more menacing. The creature was near, its presence a reminder that time was running out, and that the true test of his courage was yet to come. As Kael ventured deeper into the heart of the Moonlit Isles, the weight of his quest pressed heavily upon him. The forest seemed to whisper its secrets, guiding him toward a familiar figure, Lyra. Her expression was a mix of relief and urgency as she approached, clutching an ancient, weathered scroll in her hands. "I've found something," she said, her voice trembling with both excitement and apprehension. The scroll detailed an ancient ritual, one that could finally end the curse plaguing their village. But as they read together, the truth became painfully clear. The ritual required a willing sacrifice, a selfless act of surrender to the waters, and the serpent, the guardian of the Isles, would only be appeased if the pendant, the source of its power, was returned to its depths. Kael's heart sank. The pendant had become more than just a relic. It was a symbol of hope, a connection to the past. To part with it felt like losing a piece of himself. But the true cost was even greater. The sacrifice had to be made willingly, and Kael couldn't bear the thought of anyone giving their life for this cause. His mind raced, torn between the duty to his village and the moral burden of such a choice. "There has to be another way," he muttered, his voice heavy with despair. "I can't ask anyone to do this." Lyra, ever the steadfast friend, stepped forward. Her eyes were resolute, though her hands trembled. "If it comes to it, I'll make the sacrifice," she said, her voice steady but soft. The offer was selfless, born of her unwavering loyalty, but Kael couldn't accept it. "No," he said firmly, his voice rising with determination. "I won't let you, Lyra. There has to be another path, another solution." His words carried a quiet resolve, a promise to himself and to her. He would find a way to save everyone without losing anyone. The scroll had given them knowledge, but it had also presented a dilemma. And as they stood there, the weight of their choices hung in the air, heavier than the ancient pendant itself. The air grew heavy, charged with an ancient energy, as the serpent burst forth from the depths of the temple's sacred pool. Its massive form shimmered with iridescent scales, each one reflecting the faint glow of the moon above. Its eyes burned with primal fury as it thrashed, its tail striking the temple walls with a force that sent rubble cascading down. Kael and Lyra stood frozen for a moment, the weight of their task crashing over them. But there was no time to hesitate. Lyra's voice cut through the chaos, steady and commanding. "We need to draw it away from the temple. Now." Kale nodded, gripping the pendant tightly as they moved in unison. The pendant's power hummed in his hand, a faint warmth that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. Together, they darted across the crumbling stone floor, their movements synchronized as if they had trained for this moment all their lives. The serpent turned its gaze on them, its massive head weaving through the air like a storm cloud. Kael and Lyra worked in tandem, using the pendant's light to distract and disorient the beast. Each time it lunged, they dodged, their trust in each other growing stronger with every passing second. It was as if the years of separation melted away, replaced by the unspoken understanding that had once defined their bond. But the serpent's strength was relentless. Its tail slammed into a pillar, sending shards of stone raining down. Kale shielded Lyra, his heart racing as he realized the pendant's power wasn't enough to stop it. The beast was too powerful, too ancient. His mind raced, searching for a solution, until it landed on the truth he had been avoiding. The ritual. It was the only way. Kale turned to Lyra, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions within him. "The pendant can weaken it, but it won't be enough. We need to complete the ritual." Lyra's eyes widened, the realization dawning on her. "No," she said firmly. "There has to be another way." But Kale shook his head. This was never just about stopping the serpent. It's about restoring balance, even if it costs everything. As the serpent roared, its fury echoing through the ruins, Kale took a step toward the heart of the temple. The pendant's light grew brighter, a beacon in the darkness. Together, they would face the final test, but the price of victory loomed closer than ever. As the ritual reached its climax, Kale stepped forward, ready to offer himself as the sacrifice to save the Moonlit Isles. His heart pounded, but he felt a strange calm, knowing this act might restore balance to the Enchanted Waters. Just as he began to speak the ancient words, Lyra surged forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "No," she cried, unrolling the ancient scroll she had discovered in the temple's depths. Her hands trembled as she began to chant, her voice blending with the rising hum of the pendant's power. The pendant flared to life, its light merging with the energy of the waters. Lyra's words altered the ritual's purpose, redirecting its force. The energy surged outward, forming a shimmering barrier that encircled the serpent, trapping it within a prison of light. The temple shook violently as the serpent thrashed, its roars echoing through the chamber, but the barrier held firm. For a moment, everything seemed suspended in time. The serpent frozen, the temple groaning under the strain of its ancient magic. But the pendant, unable to withstand the immense energy it had channeled, shattered into fragments. The loss of its power sent a final tremor through the temple, cracks spreading across the walls and ceiling. Kale grabbed Lyra's hand, pulling her toward the exit as the temple began to collapse around them. Together, they raced through the crumbling corridors, the sound of falling stone echoing behind them. Emerging into the night air, they stumbled onto the shore just as the temple sank beneath the waves, its spires disappearing into the dark waters. The serpent, sealed once more, was left to its eternal prison beneath the depths. Kael and Lyra stood in silence, their breaths heavy, watching as the waters calmed and the moonlight bathed the isles in its soft glow. Though the pendant was gone, its sacrifice had saved their world. The legend of the Moonlit Isles would live on, a testament to their courage and the enduring power of the Enchanted Waters. Back on the surface, the air felt different, lighter, fresher, as if the very essence of the Moonlit Isles had been reborn. Kale stood at the edge of the shore, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the waves shimmered with the life they had fought so hard to restore. The pendant, once a symbol of hope and burden, was gone. Its disappearance marked the end of their perilous journey, but for Kale, it also carried the weight of what had been sacrificed along the way. His village was safe, the enchanted waters flowing once more, yet the memory of the choices they'd made lingered like a shadow in his mind. Lyra, ever the beacon of resilience, stepped beside him. Her presence was steady, her eyes reflecting the vibrant blue of the revitalized waters. "It's not just the Isles that have been given a second chance," she said gently. "We have too." Her words were meant to comfort, to remind him that their actions, though heavy with consequence, had also brought about renewal. For Lyra, the journey had been transformative, a chance to shed the weight of the past and step into a future filled with possibilities. Kale sighed, his shoulders tense with the burden of guilt. "I keep thinking about what we lost, what I could have done differently," he admitted, his voice low. Lyra turned to him, her expression softening. "You can't carry that forever," she said. "Guilt won't change what's happened, but it can stop you from moving forward." "The Isles are alive again because of what we did. That's the legacy we leave behind." Her words struck a chord, but Kale remained silent, his thoughts still tangled in the echoes of their journey. Lyra placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "This isn't just about saving the Isles," she continued. "It's about what we do with the life we've been given. Let it teach you, but don't let it define you." Her voice carried a quiet strength, a reminder that even in the face of loss, there was room for growth, for hope. As the sun dipped lower, casting the sky in hues of amber and rose, the two stood together, the weight of their shared journey settling into something more. The enchanted waters lapped gently at the shore, a testament to the balance they had restored. For Kale, the path ahead was uncertain, but Lyra's unwavering optimism offered a glimmer of light, a chance to let go of what was and embrace what could be. The Moonlit Isles had been saved, and in their own way, perhaps they had been too. The village erupted in joyous celebration as the tides returned, their waters shimmering under the moonlight like liquid silver. Music and laughter filled the air, and the scent of freshly cooked fish wafted through the streets, a reminder of the life Kale once knew. Yet, as he stood at the edge of the crowd, he felt an unfamiliar distance between himself and the people he once called family. The simple fisherman who had cast nets and mended boats was gone, replaced by someone who had seen wonders and faced dangers far beyond the horizon. Lyra noticed his quiet contemplation and approached, her presence calm and steady. "This place will always be a part of you," she said softly, "but the tides have brought more than just water back to your life. The Isles hold secrets we've only begun to uncover. Perhaps it's time we explore them together to ensure those secrets are protected." Kale gazed out at the endless sea, its waves whispering promises of the unknown. He realized that his journey had changed him in ways he couldn't fully grasp, but one thing was clear: he could never return to the life he once led. With a nod, he turned to Lyra. "You're right. There's more out there than I ever imagined, and I can't just walk away from it now." Together, they prepared a small boat, its sails catching the first light of dawn as they set out from the village. The Isle of the Moonlit Tides loomed in the distance, a place of mystery and power that had shaped both their paths. Kale felt a mix of anticipation and uncertainty, but Lyra's resolve was unwavering. Side by side, they sailed toward the horizon, ready to face whatever challenges awaited. As the village faded behind them, Kale couldn't help but reflect on how far he'd come. No longer just a fisherman, he was now a guardian of the Isles, bound to their magic and their secrets. The journey ahead would be uncertain, but for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond the rhythms of the tides. Together, they would navigate the unknown, not just as explorers, but as protectors of a world that few would ever understand. As the boat cuts through the calm, moonlit waters, Kale's gaze is drawn to something unusual, a faint, ethereal glow shimmering just beneath the surface. It's a shard of the pendant, its edges jagged but still radiating a soft, pulsating energy. The sight stops him cold. His hand hovers over the water, torn between reaching for it and letting it vanish into the ocean's embrace. Lyra stands nearby, her eyes locked on him, but she says nothing. This isn't her choice to make. The silence between them is heavy, filled with unspoken questions. Should he reclaim a piece of the power that once threatened to consume him, or leave it behind, letting the sea claim it forever? The glowing shard becomes more than just an object. It's a mirror of Kale's inner struggle. The temptation to regain strength battles against his hard-earned resolve to protect the Moonlit Isles from the very forces that could destroy it. Every second feels like an eternity, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. And as the waves gently rock the boat, the choice he makes in this moment could redefine not just his path, but the fate of the Isles themselves. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet, Kale stood at the edge of the boat, the ancient shard cradled in his hands. Its surface caught the fading light, shimmering with memories of a past he once clung to so tightly. But now, in this quiet moment, he felt the weight of it not just in his hands, but in his heart. With a deep breath, he leaned over the rail and let the shard slip from his fingers, watching as it disappeared into the depths of the Enchanted Waters. It was a release, not just of an object, but of the pain and regret that had tethered him for so long. Beside him, Lyra placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her presence a quiet reassurance. Together, they watched as the waves swallowed the shard, the waters seeming to shimmer in acknowledgement. There was no grand fanfare, no dramatic crescendo, just the simple, profound act of letting go. And in that moment, Kale felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The past was no longer a chain, but a stepping stone towards something new. As the boat glided forward, carried by the current, Kael and Lyra stood side by side, their bond stronger than ever. The Moonlit Isles were safe, their journey here complete, but the horizon stretched endlessly before them, filled with possibilities. The world was vast, and they both knew this was only the beginning. There were uncharted seas to explore, new challenges to face, and stories yet to be written. The Enchanted Waters, ever mysterious and ever watchful, seemed to whisper of the legends yet to come. For every shard returned to the depths, for every tale brought to its close, there were countless more waiting to unfold. Kael and Lyra, now bound by shared purpose and unspoken understanding, sailed onward, their hearts light and their spirits ready. As the stars began to dot the night sky, the story of the Moonlit Isles faded into the tapestry of lore, leaving behind a promise that the Enchanted Waters would continue to weave the fates of those who dared to dream. And so, the journey continued, not with an ending, but with a whisper of the adventures yet to come.